Coming up next, from San Fran Freak Show, the Savage Nation. From Talk 910 KNEW.
On the air, online, and on the go. This is Talk 910 KNEW.
Warning. The Michael Savage Show contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised.
America's most exciting radio talk show, The Savage Nation. Here is Michael Savage.
The Vietnam War is still an emotional topic for most. Our military was successful in doing their jobs, but lies and pressure from the left and the media turned these victories into defeat. There's a new book out that recasts Vietnam's tainted image and tells inspiring stories of American heroism and the South Vietnamese relentless fight for freedom. It's entitled Ride the Thunder. Joining us now is the author, Richard Botkin. Richard, what drove you to write this book?
Hi, Dr. Savage. Thanks so much for having me on today. Ride the Thunder, and the full title really is critical here, Michael. Ride the Thunder, a Vietnam War story of honor and triumph. I had to add that line on there because there isn't much honor or triumph, personal honor and triumph associated with our efforts in Vietnam. And Ride the Thunder itself comes from a Teddy Roosevelt speech I saw when I was a young Marine, and I am not a Vietnam veteran, by the way. I served after Vietnam. But Ride the Thunder comes from a Teddy Roosevelt speech in which he spoke of the men who quelled the storm and ride the thunder. It was the man in the arena speech. It was a call to manhood. But Teddy Roosevelt was the last American president that had the guts to call men to meaning in their lives and to serve in higher causes. And that speech moved me as a young man. I carried it around, and I always thought if I wrote a book, it's going to be called Ride the Thunder, because Marines and soldiers, those who want to serve their country and serve in a higher cause, are romantics. And Teddy Roosevelt had the ability to stir people in that. And so anyway, this book is about a number of American Marine officers and South Vietnamese Marine officers who really rode the thunder. These were honorable guys. It's nothing more than a war story about good men facing tough times and overcoming those tough times. In addition, where appropriate, I included wives, because their wives, especially for the Vietnamese, were so critical in their ability to overcome the challenges they faced.
We hear from the radical left that the Vietnam War was not a just cause and we had no business being there, but your book tells a different story.
It does. It tells a different story in that we talk early on in Ride the Thunder about the American Marine involvement, especially my main American character, my main fighting American Marine character, a gentleman, Captain John Ripley. We talk about his first tour in 1967, in which he was a rifle company commander. Up near the northern portion of the country, up near the demilitarized zone. Incredible fighting on a daily basis, and we talk about his bayonet charge, something that is new history in talking with him and some of his Marines. The bayonet charge that he ordered up was miraculous, and that it was successful. No Marines were killed, and the bad guys hightailed it out of the area. That was a fun thing to write about because of the obvious good outcome. It might have turned differently had not there been a favorable intervention from above. I don't know. But what I try to do is give the reader an appreciation for what the American Marines were doing, and at the same time, talk about the South Vietnamese effort. That's something that has not been written, Michael, has not been written about in history, and certainly when the communists took over in the North, the victors get to write history. The good guy stuff was essentially written out of history.
This revision of history seems to have started during the Vietnam War by our own media.
I agree. The media trend was probably never very favorable in Vietnam at all, but especially with the Tet Offensive of 1968, when the Americans and South Vietnamese turned back the North Vietnamese invasion and essentially destroyed the Viet Cong infrastructure. They destroyed them and killed them by the tens of thousands, and yet the American will to fight that war was lost on the television sets on American college campuses, and the political center of gravity moved from the battlefield into the United States, where again, college campuses and the political arena, there was really no hope of winning after that.
Why do you think Vietnam turned out the way that it did?
Good question, Michael. The events from basically the spring of 1972 onward were interesting. What happened in 1972, and we have this in Ride the Thunder, the American ground effort had essentially ceased. We had about 100,000 troops still in Vietnam, but most of these people were there to help the Vietnamese Vietnamize the war, if you will. They were support troops, combat support troops, but all the infantry types had already left. There were a few helicopter units that were involved in action, but really the major combat effort was now being prosecuted by the South Vietnamese. We had advisors there, and that's what we focus on in Ride the Thunder, my American Marine advisors. The Communists launched in late March of 1972 the biggest offensive to date of the war, bigger by far than Tet of 68, which many Americans will recall. The Easter Offensive of 1972 began with an invasion of about 4 divisions, roughly 40,000 troops, hundreds and hundreds of tanks, and unprecedented amounts of rockets and artillery. They came across the demilitarized zone, which was by treaty not allowed for them to do. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, they caught the South somewhat unawares, and the South ultimately beat them back thanks to the efforts of American air power and a very resilient and improving South Vietnamese military, Army and Marines, and these guys beat them back. Once that had taken place, we go into the summer of 72. The South continues to push them back into the elections of 1972, and President Nixon is trying to craft some sort of peace treaty with the North Vietnamese, and many of our listeners may recall that wasn't successful. So we had the Christmas bombing of 1972. It was known as Operation Linebacker 2. And Linebacker 2, a 12-day bombing campaign, except for Christmas Day, they didn't bomb on Christmas Day, was considered to be the most intense bombing campaign of the war. And many believe, as I do, that the communists were close to coming to a surrender even, because we were just finally giving them what they should have gotten earlier, probably. But American political leadership did not exploit that advantage that we had. So anyway, we craft the peace with honor, in which there was no peace and no honor. In early 1973, all American troops leave except for a very few number of troops left. The POWs come home, and that was a huge issue for Americans. Americans who had demonstrated no patriotism or fervor for the troops who had fought there gave more to the POWs when they came home and gave them at least some sort of a heroic homecoming, their tumultuous parades, those sorts of things. But once the POWs were home and that treaty was crafted, American interest in the war trailed off. We had, right before the end of 72, given Vietnam all kinds of aircraft and supplies and equipment to make them effective on their own. They were known to have the 4th largest air force in the world. What people need to understand, that those numbers aren't really that accurate. They had lots of airplanes. Most of them were helicopters. The Soviets had supplied the North Vietnamese with the latest anti-aircraft artillery. So where the Vietnamese were fighting, the South Vietnamese were fighting with helicopters and propeller-driven planes, they were going up against first-rate anti-aircraft artillery that even the best American airplanes at the time didn't have effective countermeasures for. Anyway, so we go into 73. And in the summer of 1973, after President Nixon, in order to get President II to agree to all these peace treaties, had promised him that if the communists broke the treaties, we would respond with American air power. The Congress passed something called the Fulbright-Aiken Amendment, and that was really game over. The Fulbright-Aiken Amendment basically cut off all funding for any further, after August 15th of 1972, there would be no more funding for any American combat operations anywhere in Southeast Asia. So if the communists continued to break the treaty as they already had, and we hadn't done anything, but if they really pressed home, we would not respond as a fighting ally. And the communists, of course, were perceptive enough to understand that was a green light for them. And then on top of that, we cut the aid that we were giving them. On top of that, the price of oil, because of the Yom Kippur War and OPEC's rise in power, the value of our aid, the purchasing power of our aid was denigrated significantly. And all that equipment we'd given them became paperweights, if you will, because they could not afford to operate them. And the communists pressed ahead for victory, and it became a self-fulfilling outcome.
Well, what do you want people to take away from your book?
Ride the Thunder again, is really a book about good men facing tough times and overcoming those tough times.